I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I know that the feast has only so many free days and so many afternoons for everyone to get things taken care of, but appreciate all those that have come out, and certainly we want to make it a very valuable hour and 15 minutes here to learn more about God's Word, but also maybe get ourselves a little more in tune to some of the events that are happening in the world, because you need to remember something very important. And while it looks like everything is falling apart, the truth of the matter is it's all coming together. So don't forget that. You look at the world today, the British had a vote 3.5 years ago about Brexit, and the losers refused to acknowledge they lost the election. There's been a cat fight in Britain ever since. Brexit hasn't happened. Every time they get close, every time the Prime Minister gets close to an agreement, somehow the Northern Ireland group and the Scottish group, apologies to the Scots in the audience, or Scotsmen in the audience, somehow are able to stop it, and now they've already gone through, I think, was it 2 or 3 prime ministers they've run out of office on this thing. So it's a sad situation there, but it's no different than what's happened in our country, which we had an election, and the losing side refused to acknowledge the election took place or to accept it, and so they are fighting every step of the way. There are riots today in Chile. As you know, there was a collapse of the Mexican government yesterday, if you watched any news last night, where the drug dealers demanded that El Chapo's son be released, and Mexicans said no, so the drug dealers sent in an army that was bigger than the army of Mexico that was there and shot up a whole town, and they had armored personnel carriers and 50 caliber machine guns. They also had squad saw guns, which are extremely hard to get. They should only be given to U.S. units and their closest allies. Somehow they had a bunch of them. And so the Mexican government turned over El Chapo's son and surrendered, essentially, to the drug cartels. So, but it's comforting to us because they're only coming across our border at about 500 a day, with the 500 to 1,000 of the cartel members a day are coming across. So no problem. But anyway, we also have the same situation in so many places around the world. Hong Kong recently has had riots and fights. So we know that there is a demon influence around the world. God allows Satan to be on the march. And, Satan's kind of like a poodle dog. How many have ever seen poodles on these little strings? They have a little kind of a clipper on. You punch this trigger and a poodle stops dead in his tracks. So they're little poodle. And I just say that because I really don't like poodles. Now, my apologies to the poodle owners. You may love your poodle, and that's fine. I prefer a bigger, real dog. But so, and my Chesapeake Retriever could play fetch with most poodles, meaning the poodle would be the play toy. But anyway, the important thing is God in the book of Job is very clear that Satan is on a leash, and God allows him a little bit farther. He tells you can do this to Job, but no farther. You can do this to Job, but no farther. And he does that in a number of places. So we know that God is allowing Satan to be very influential around the world. And so we're going to look at some of the things he's doing today. I think we should start with prayer. So if you bow your heads, I'll ask an opening prayer for us. Eternal great God, we're very thankful for this day, certainly a beautiful feast you've given to us here. What a wonderful time we've had, what a beautiful message we were able to hear today from our president, Mr. Kubik, and a great picture of the mountain of the Lord that we all aspire to be a part of. We ask for your help today in understanding some of your prophecies and looking forward to the time when we can recognize these things occurring and making sure that we are a part of that great coming kingdom. So we thank you so much for this. We thank you that we can count on you to protect us. In Hebrews 13, you promise us you will never leave us or forsake us. And that is truly the what sustains us, the foundation of our life. So we thank you so much for that, and we ask your blessing this afternoon in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so the title of the sermon, the message now is the coming, or the signs of a one-world government coming. I'm hoping that this is not what we wanted. That's what we wanted. Okay, signs of a one-world government coming. Subtitle is A World Dictator About to Appear. Now, I did not make that title up. In fact, as most of you know, it came from the very first edition of the Plain Truth magazine in 1934. Now, in February of 1934, Hitler was on the scene, but he had not yet revealed his war machine or what he was planning on doing. He had not yet taken the Sudetenland or Czechoslovakia. Mussolini was on the march somewhat, hadn't quite yet invaded down into Africa. The Japanese had invaded over into China. But if you've read this article, and if you haven't read it in a long time, I suggest you go back and read it again just for a kind of historical perspective. Most of the article is going through the events that will happen at the end time. It's a very good summary. It's amazing how early Mr. Armstrong understood these truths. But he goes through a number of events that we'll be going through today. But the final conclusion he makes in this article is that no dictator is going to appear, but Jesus Christ is going to. He's going to take over the entire earth. While other dictators might appear and might claim to be, some great leader, eventually only Jesus Christ is going to rule the earth. So it's a great feast message. But Mr. Armstrong gave this a long time ago, and it's amazing how the truth is eternal and does not change. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs out of that article. If I can get this thing to, there we go. He said, "We live today in the most strenuous, anxious, momentous hours of Earth's history. Today we stand on the very threshold of colossal events that will stagger the mind of mortal man. Just now it is like the lull before a great storm, or great and devastating storm. Everyone senses it." Now, how much more true is that today than it was in 1934? People know that things that have held this world together are coming apart, and the various divisions, the polarizations, the animosities are growing by day. He says, "The lust for power, ever since the pharaohs ruled in ancient Egypt, on down through ancient Syria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, on to Napoleon and then the Kaiser, there has been a lust for power to rule the world. Today, at least 3 major world powers seek to rule the world." And of course, he was talking about Russia, about Germany, and Japan. So he says, what is going to happen? Will some Superman now emerge? Will the nations get together and appoint a dictator? And he points out in the article that, yes, that will happen, but it will be short-lived. Mortal man cannot prophesy the turns and trends of coming events. Only God knows the end from the beginning. And so we depend on God and the reveal information in His Word to give us hope. And we know what's going to happen at the very end. Obviously, prophecy hasn't happened yet. Many of the events of prophecy have not happened yet. So we could do the best we can to discern. God has given us a very good picture, a good overall picture. But we need to understand that we will recognize it when it happens. The main purpose of studying the prophecies in God's Word is to make sure that we have a determination to be there and that we're going to be coming out of the beast power, not being a part of this world society, and then recognizing events as they occur. Now, there are many people who have warned about a coming world power. In fact, even we've had presidents way back as far as the 1950s that have warned it. Now, I'm not sure how many of you remember Larry McDonald. He was the head of the John Birch Society. He was also a congressman for, I believe, South Carolina. And he said back in the early 1980s, the drive of the Rockefellers and their allies is to create a one-world government combining super capitalism and communism under the same tent, all under their control. Do I mean conspiracy? Yes, I do. I'm convinced there is such a plot. International in scope, generations old in planning, and already incredibly evil in intent. Now, it's not our purpose here today to examine conspiracy theories, but simply to quote what some other people have said and have basically warned us about. Now, as you might remember, Larry McDonald was killed in a plane crash that is still a fairly enigmatic event in American history. He died September 1st, 1983. I remember that day fairly well because I was over on the coast at Yachats getting ready to go down to a Bible study in Seal Rock, which we had enough people on the coast in for a small Bible study. And I heard on the news that the Korean airliner Flight 007 had been shot down by a Soviet fighter. And of course, I was looking across the Pacific Ocean, and I thought, well, across that ocean, which is almost half the size of the Earth in size, there's a whole bunch of people who were killed by the Russians. And there was never anything done about it. It says Larry McDonald was an American politician, member of the United States House of Representatives, representing the 7th Congressional District of, I guess it was Georgia. As a Democrat, he was passenger on board Korean Airlines Flight 007 when it was shot down by Soviet interceptors and presumed dead. He was known for his staunch opposition to communism and believed in the long-standing covert efforts by Trilateral Commission and other powerful U.S. groups to bring about a socialism and world government. He was also a cousin of George S. Patton. Now, the U.S. government made no charge, but his widow claims that her husband, the national chairman of the John Birch Society, was murdered. And she also holds that it was no accident that the leading anti-communist in the American government had been on a plane that was forced into Soviet territory and shot down. And if you remember the news reports after that time, the plane went down in the Pacific Ocean. The plane did not land on Russian territory, which I thought was kind of odd that it somehow flew over Russian territory, but when they shot it down, it landed in the Pacific Ocean. So just one of those, I wonder if there's something more to this story than what they're telling us. We've recently had other things happen, like this fellow that was in prison for having this island of young girls, that he mysteriously committed suicide twice because the first time it didn't quite work. Even our president said that's probably, very likely did not commit suicide. But there's a lot of things we don't know about that are going on behind the scenes. Certainly, if you look at what has happened in America and also in Britain and other places, there's just a lot that we don't know about. It is not open, it is not candid. Just going back in time a little bit, Albert Einstein said, "I advocate world government because I am convinced that there is no other possible way of eliminating the most terrible danger in which man has ever found himself. The objective of avoiding total destruction must have priority over any other objective." And so a very famous man in history, perhaps the most famous scientist or physicist, and the father of the atomic bomb, E=mc² formula, and certainly I think, just somebody who would know what he was saying. By the way, we have checked these quotes and double-checked them to make sure they are accurate. You can go on the internet and find quotes made by so-and-so about whatever, and then you double-check them and fact-check them and find out they have been either cherry-picked and put together from other things they said, or perhaps they're even fiction. So I had several things in here that I wanted to get checked out, but Mr. Jacoby, who puts these things together for me and makes it look good on PowerPoint, was able to find that there were one or two that we needed to make sure we didn't show because they're not sustainable, they're not provable. Okay, then you all know who this guy was, John Paul II, probably the most famous pope of the last century at any rate. He said, "By the end of this decade, we will live under their first one-world government that has ever existed in the Society of Nations." Now, he may have jumped the gun on that, but he said a government with absolute authority to decide the basic issues of human survival. So there are certain buzzwords and certain cues that they use, the one-world government promoters, and human survival is one of those. One-world government is inevitable. Many of us can remember back at the days of a fellow named Paul Ehrlich back in the 1970s who wrote the population bomb, and he said that the world would essentially come to an end in the 1990s because there were too many people. There wouldn't be enough food, there wouldn't be enough of anything, and so he actually advocated forced sterilization of much of the world's population and a number of other very bizarre interventionist moves. Of course, Paul Ehrlich was wrong. The world has almost tripled in population since then, certainly way more than doubled. And we still are producing more food than we need because God has given us such a very beautiful, productive world. But John Paul II was one who certainly advocated for a one-world government. And in order to make a change of something like that, it has to be talked about a lot. They talk about it and talk about it. Eventually, people become pretty much inured to it. You're used to it, and so you no longer have the reaction. Everybody's famous or favorite person, George Soros. He has some other quotes on the internet, like his number one goal is the destruction of the United States, and others. You might want to check those out and verify them. But certainly he has used his billions of dollars to fund a large number of organizations that basically cause disruption. Antifa and other people that like to march in downtown Portland, overturn cars and various things, get a lot of their money from him. If you wonder where do these guys get them, I have to go to work, you have to go to work, right? Where do all these young kids in their late teens and 20s and 30s have enough money to do all this demonstrating and causing chaos around the country? Well, he has a number of fronts that he supports, as do other people, not just him, that are supporting those people, paying them so much a day, whatever. But very, very influential man, and his goal is to be somehow establishing one world order. You might know that his background, he was at SS Capo in World War II. Anybody know what a capo is? They were the natives who lived in that country who were then the enforcement guards in the concentration camps. So when the Germans built a concentration camp in Romania, they didn't have Germans get the billy clubs and go out and keep people in line. They hired locals called capos. So he was a capo, Romanian-Hungarian for the Nazis. And there are pictures of him when he was a teenager doing that. So that's not something that's unsubstantiated. So certainly a very suspicious background at best. Henry Kissinger, many of us remember him from the Vietnam era and the negotiation of the Vietnam War treaty. I'm not sure you'd call it a treaty, but certainly the end of the war. He says, he who controls the food supply controls the people. Who controls the energy can control whole continents. Who controls money can control the world. So there are three areas that he said this world government needs to focus on: controlling food, controlling energy, and controlling money. So I think that's probably those are areas that we need to watch. And certainly the energy business with all of its oil and all the various other ways that it has tentacles, natural gas, oil, wind energy, other ways, coal, very important, often in the news. And of course, controlling the money, that's pretty much beyond the comprehension of most of us. If anybody ever read the book, The Big Short, about how the crisis of 2010 came about, it's impossible to figure all this out between these big bankers. And they even made a movie out of it trying to make it understandable, and I think it fell short of that goal. So at any rate, we have big names that have really promoted one world government. David Rockefeller said this present window of opportunity during which a truly peaceful and interdependent world order might be built will not be open for too long. We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the new world order. To begin with, though, there has to be a desensitization of resistance to that concept. And that desensitization is going on now, as there's much talk about, no borders, anti-nationality, whatever. And I think that probably our current president was sort of upset the plan because he's one who actually wanted to fight the cultural war, whereas the other politicians we've had for about 50 years have not had any culture war fighters on the opposite side, on the resistance side. So there will be a major world crisis. That's what they're planning on, and the nations will then accept the new world order. Most of the open talk about a coming one world government comes from the United Nations. Now, there are many people that watch the United Nations. There are some who repeat their programs. The United Nations it is a monolith that is incomprehensible in size and scope, and the number of agencies and the titles of those agencies is just beyond comprehension that we have allowed this to be built, but we certainly have. In 2019, just about 6 months ago, it looks like, the Deputy Secretary General's address said this: we must all keep pushing the boundaries of transformation. The ambition of the 2030 Agenda provides a roadmap for mobilizing every segment of society, as well as public, private, domestic, and international resources. The 2030 Agenda is actually the second in a series of agendas. Before that, we had I'll show you the 2021. Unfortunately, we had a President, George Bush Sr., who was the first one to announce to the United States as our president that he supported this idea of a one world government. He says, we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the rule of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will have a chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders. And it was during this time that the United Nations began sending their white helmeted troops around the world on various peacekeeping, what they call peacekeeping missions. And so that's just, one of the U.S. presidents that, for whatever reason, I'm not criticizing, I'm just pointing out the facts of what he said, that he certainly supported us becoming a part of a United Nations dictated one world order. There's a President's Council on Sustainable Development. Keep those two words in mind, sustainable development. They are often used as buzzwords to promote this idea of a one world government. They say that so much of our development has not been sustainable that we can't keep doing what we've been doing, and so they want to change everybody's lives with anti-pollution things. Most of us, I think, support some of those concepts. Most of us don't throw litter. We don't use more energy than we need to. We try to make our part of the world a pretty nice place. We try to keep our houses nice, and maybe even we do some recycling and that type of thing. But in this case, their sustainable development is on a massive scale, and they're wanting to completely change the economies of the larger developed nations, and of course, make everybody have pretty much equal outcomes. Between June 1993 and June 1999, the President's Council on Sustainable Development has advised President Clinton on sustainable development and develops bold new approaches to achieve economic, environmental, and equity goals. So the goals in this case are economic, which means basically everybody in the earth has a same standard of living or pretty close to it. Environmental and equity goals. Now, it doesn't say what equity is. I'm not sure what it is either, but equity goals, everybody has to have the same, pretty much same outcomes. We are committed to the achievement of a dignified, peaceful, and equitable existence. Again, doesn't really say what that means, but there are some other additional writings that we can look to. A website called theconstitutionparty.com posted this from a UN publication. Agenda 21 is a comprehensive, this is by the Agenda 2021, so that they didn't quite get it done in time, so now it's been replaced by Agenda 2030. So Agenda 2021, which I believe was adopted in about 2013, but I'm not sure. And wait a minute, actually 1992 is when the process started, so let's go back to there. But Agenda 21 is a comprehensive plan of utopian environmentalism, social engineering, and global political control that was initiated at the United Nations Conference on Environmental and Development held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, 1992. If you go back and look at the treaties that were signed, not the treaty, but sort of the statement of intent, statement of purpose, the agreement by the nations at that time, it basically said that the developed nations, however, leaving out China and India, would take huge amounts of their GNP and simply ship it overseas to countries in Africa and Asia and other places as a penalty for the fact that we have been industrialized and they have not. Of course, we know where most of that money goes. It disappears into private pockets and private accounts, but they didn't say that. Agenda 21 policy is being covertly advanced in local communities across the nation through the efforts of the International Council of Local Environmental Initiatives in cooperation with the state and municipal elected officials and bureaucrats via local sustainable development policies such as smart growth, wildlands projects, resilient cities, regional visioning projects, and other green or alternative projects. So quite a number of labels that are put on these various initiatives all across the country, and these things are certainly being carried out. If you look at these things locally in your local county, you might look at your local county or city website and just say, what are we doing for smart growth, wildlands projects, resilient cities, whatever, you'll find quite a bit. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations has published, number one is no poverty. Now, why is that not possible? Who has it said you will always have the poor with you? And why does he say that? Because he knew human nature and he knew the way the world is. So the goal of no poverty is fine, but one of the most poverty-stricken nations in the Western Hemisphere has also been the recipient of by far the most money and aid of any other nation in the Western Hemisphere. I'm talking per capita. Anyone know what nation that is? It's what? Haiti. Look at the history of Haiti. They have received unbelievable billions of dollars in aid and projects and help from everybody in the West, and yet they are, again, they are still sunk in the mire of poverty, and all the money, of course, has been siphoned off by the few rich people that live there. So zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality. I've never figured out what that means. But I did about 2 weeks ago, I got this email from the city of Washougal's school district saying they were going to do this survey, and would I, as a taxpayer and whatever in the county or in the city, fill this survey out. Oh, well, I'm gonna, normally I just delete survey requests, but so I went on the survey, and first they ask, how long you live in the county and how many children you've raised. Do you have children in school? The answer is no. They're all grown now. And then they, ask various things, but one of them was your. And they ask, your age, and then they ask your sex or your gender, and there were 7 options. 7. And one of them was uncommitted, and then there were binary. I'm going to go back and find that survey again and write them all down. But I never knew. I thought it was boys and girls. I didn't realize in Genesis 3 when God said He created male and female. Actually, there are 7 categories of male and female. So anyway, it's just one of those things. What is gender equality? Who knows? Affordable and clean energy, clean water and sanitation, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. You've all seen all of these. Number 13, climate action seems to be the one that's in the news all the time. Sustainable cities and communities. That one, of course, is a buzzword often used. Life below water, life on land. So life below water, I think they mean maybe the massive pollution of our oceans that is taking place. There are islands of plastic. It's abominable what we have done to our oceans. A few years ago, I did a 19-mile hike up the Washington coast from Redondo Beach up to just north of Nia Bay at the point up there. In fact, it wasn't Nia Bay. But anyway, the amount of plastic junk and other debris that has floated up on the ocean, on the beaches, is just awful. It's appalling. And yet they continue to dump, especially the Oriental nations, continue to dump tons and tons and tons of that into the ocean every single day. So that has to be addressed at some point. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. The word justice is thrown about many, many times, and of course is often misleading too. Let's go on down. They also published the UN Development Program on their own website. Says this: 5 things you need to know about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The 2030 Agenda applies to all countries and people. They use the word actors. In other words, you are not going to avoid this program. Number 2, the Sustainable Development Goals are interlinked, which means everybody has to participate. Number 3, leaving no one behind. And of course, the No One Left Behind program in our public schools has been an unmitigated disaster, with everything collapsing as far as achievement goals, that type of thing, and real worthwhile education, but still we're not going to do it on a worldwide basis. Development must be smart. If not, it's risk-informed. It's not sustainable. I'm not sure what they mean, it must be smart, but there probably are places that they posted where they tell us. Everyone is needed. So twice they have said in this that it applies to everyone, that they plan on it applying to all denizens, all people of the earth. Agenda 21 was analyzed by a writer named Ron Taylor. He says to achieve one world government, the UN needs 3 powers. The power to tax, an international tax, judicial powers, the power to make judgments between disputes between nations and other issues, and finally, a standing army. And so they don't have the tax in yet, but they've tried it several times. The 2010 Cancun Climate Summit gave the UN the authority to impose carbon taxes on prosperous nations. Again, they left out China, which is the most polluting nation in the world, and India, which is pretty much second in terms of tons of carbon, pollutants put in the air. But the 2010 Cancun Climate Summit allowed them to at least say they are going to take lots of money from the developed nations and transfer it over to people in undeveloped nations. The International Criminal Court was established in 2002 in The Hague, Netherlands. So far, their decisions have been almost ignored. They have no enforcement apparatus. They don't send the white-helmeted policemen in to arrest you. Quite a number of, let's just say, ne'er-do-well world tyrants have been tried in absentia in the international court, and of course they have not served prison sentences or paid any penalties. But it's at least already established, the criminal court at The Hague, and it is in place, so we'll see if they develop a way to give it more power. The UN has blue helmeted soldiers, volunteers from member states that go to various places around the globe. Now, this is a man we need to be very careful of. I don't know if you've watched Pope Francis, the current Pope. He replaced Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict when his past was revealed. Mr. Anastasi over in Italy told me the real skinny that everybody in Italy knows about why he had to resign. But the basic thing was because if he left the Vatican, he would be arrested and sent back to Germany. Germany actually had an arrest warrant out for Cardinal Ratzinger back when he was a cardinal in Germany. So the official line that was given when he resigned as Pope was that he wanted to spend the rest of his life locked up in the Vatican praying. So he lives in the Vatican, and as it is a separate nation with no extradition treaties to other countries, he can stay there. His replacement, Pope Francis, was from Argentina. He had never set foot in the United States when he became Pope. He is currently, I think, the most powerful influence in the world, leading the charge with the one-world socialism, the one-world government. So Pope Francis told the Italian newspaper La Repubblica that the United States of America has a distorted vision of the world, and Americans must be ruled by a world government as soon as possible for their own good. In the same interview, according to La Repubblica, Pope Francis said that Europe must take on a federal structure resembling feudal times when the peasants were ruled by unimpeachable monarchs. By the way, who else ruled in feudal times besides the unimpeachable monarchs? The popes did. Remember the 7 resurrections of the Roman Empire? They controlled all of feudal Europe. Pope Francis reiterates his call for a new world order. This is 2015. Pope Francis wrapped up the first leg of a 3-nation South American pilgrimage Wednesday in Quito, Ecuador, after issuing an impassioned call for a new economic and ecological world order where the goods of the earth are shared by everyone. So you work hard, you have a house and a car and some food, and they come and say, we're going to take one of your cars and half your food and give it to somebody who's never worked a day in their life because it's not fair. That's a little bit of exaggeration maybe, but that's their thinking, that everybody has to have the same equal outcomes. It used to be called Stalinism, or actually Karl Marxism and communism, but now it's just simply the New World Order is at least one of their ideas, or one of the things they want to accomplish. In June 2015, Pope Francis called for a new global political authority that would have the resources necessary to deal with the world's economic problems and injustices. So what is unjust or problems that are economic? Well, obviously, some nations are more prosperous than others. For instance, Venezuela is collapsing economically while the United States is prospering. So in some people's minds, that is unjust, even though the causes for that are well known. A year later, Pope Francis told hundreds of thousands of young people gathered for World Youth Day in Poland that they need to believe in a new humanity, and that they should refuse to see borders as barriers. In other words, the world has just one population. They don't need to have any borders, no countries. And John Lennon's song, Imagine, will come to pass. Imagine there are no countries. Imagine there is no religion, except, of course, what the Pope wants you to have. A year after that, the Pope has argued that the creation of the one-world government is needed to combat such major issues as climate change. So we'll watch what this Pope does. He may or may not be the one who eventually really pressures or offers his services to combine nations together. As Rockefeller said, it will take an international crisis of some kind to where everybody says we have to have a strong world leader and a strong central government to stop all this suffering. Now, I want to begin in Daniel chapter 2 today as far as the scriptures go. We'll try to spend the rest of the time in the Bible. What we are waiting for is the feet and the 10 toes. The iron and clay, the iron of the Roman Empire of the legs, and then the final resurrection of that, the 10 toes, is what is next in the line of world history. Daniel chapter 2 is the foundational chapter of prophecy. It lays out the major 4 world-ruling empires that would start with Nebuchadnezzar all the way through the return of Jesus Christ. This gives us an outline, this statute does. Chapters 7 and 8 give us more details. It calls each one of these pieces of metal by an animal, a leopard or a bear, you recall that. And then, of course, Daniel 11 gives us a lot more information about the final ban of sin, or the final abomination of desolation. And then the book of Revelation fills out quite a bit in the way of more details, but it's all building on Daniel chapter 2. So you must start here at Daniel chapter 2 when we're talking about prophecy and what's going to happen in the future. So Daniel chapter 2, in fact, Mr. Kubik read this today. I really appreciated the sermon very much. Notice he has legs of iron. The Roman Empire was very solid and they dominated the world. It's amazing that in 150 years they went from being a backwater, little place on the Tiber River in central Italy to controlling about 80% of the Mediterranean, and they expanded in history almost like no nation ever has, from being almost a backwater of the Greek area to completely controlling the Mediterranean as its own lake. So the history of the Roman Empire, especially not the empire, but the republic, and the last couple of hundred years of that, Africanus, Specio Africanus, and some of the great things they did in overcoming the Carthage challenge is amazing. You know, the largest sea battle in history of boats was between Carthage and Rome off the island of Sicily. And so we've had some big battles since then. Probably in terms of firepower, it wasn't like what we have now, but they had flamethrowers and a lot of other things. But if you read the history of Carthage, especially that last 150 years, the Punic Wars, it's just a kind of a sad history, but it just shows you what anger can do. Hannibal's father, of course, was killed, and he was very upset at what the Romans did to him in the First Punic War, so that Hannibal decides to go attack Rome and Italy from the north, going through Spain, going through north. He wanted to get back at them for what they'd done to his father, and of course he pretty much did. He ran rampant all over for 10 years, the peninsula of Italy, but he was never able to conquer Rome because the walls were too big. But then he eventually was exiled, went over to areas in modern-day Turkey, and then finally went back to Tunisia, what we call Tunisia today, but Carthage was defeated in a battle down there. And then the Romans went down and said, well, he destroyed, laid waste to Italy, so we're going to lay waste to him. And they destroyed the entire Carthaginian Empire and almost overturned it. It took them a year and a half to tear the city of Carthage apart piece by piece. So anyway, interesting history. Didn't want to get into that too much, except that when men decide they're going to get back at a foreign country for what that foreign country has done to them, history shows it's been a lot of suffering and a lot of millions of people killed for no reason other than somebody's mad. Daniel chapter 2, verse 34 says, you watch while a stone was cut without hands. Jesus Christ is the stone, symbolized by that stone of scone that was Jacob's pillar stone and is today in Scotland, taken down to England for coronations. The stone that the builders rejected, the comment about that in Isaiah, is the single most quoted verse in the New Testament from the Old. And so when Peter talks about it and Paul does, it's a very, very important concept to understand. Of all the Old Testament verses, that's the one that's quoted more than any in the New, more often. So this stone destroys the feet. It stoned the iron, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And of course, then everything collapses. All world governments then collapse together, and the wind takes it away, and the stone becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. So the fourth kingdom would be strong as iron. The Roman Empire was for many, many years. Founded in about 754 as basically ancient Rome on the Tiber. And of course, then the empire, 7 kings later, they decided to make it into a republic. And that fell in right around 44 BC when Julius Caesar declared himself emperor for life. And that didn't last very long because they killed him. But soon after that, Augustus declared it an empire, and he was the first emperor. And of course, they were controlling the world then for about 400 years after that. So whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it. Just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, the toes of the feet were partly of iron, partly of clay. The kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. So we are not looking for a world-ruling government to come that is solid, unified, together in purpose, and marching. It's not going to be the Japanese Empire of the 1930s. This is going to be a motley crew that's cobbled together and held together by a very fragile force. It is not going to be something that will be sustainable. It just simply is a kind of an opportunistic thing when it comes on the scene. There's some crisis that causes it to happen. Another verse that we need to understand applies here is Daniel chapter 4. When this tree was cut down, that represented Nebuchadnezzar. And for 7 years, he wandered as basically as an animal in the wilderness. The human spirit was taken from him. During that 7 years, apparently Daniel served as the king or as the emperor of the Persian Empire. But the truth of the matter is, I'm sorry, not Persia, but ancient Babylon. This belt that is on this stump also represents Nebuchadnezzar's government that basically is going to be kept until the second Babylon. Remember, Babylon has fallen, so there's two Babylons, and Babylon the Great has fallen is mentioned. In fact, it's the whole subject of Revelation 18. But this stump with the belt around it, the belt means it's being protected, it's being held, it's not going to rot. And so the first Babylon was cut down, 539 BC, and this second Babylon is going to come back on the scene. So that tree stump not only represented Nebuchadnezzar, but also the foundation of the system of Babylon itself, and that will come back to pass. Revelation 13 is the kind of the main chapter that we're looking forward to seeing it fulfilled. He says, I stood on the sand of the sea. The sea in this case represents all of humanity, all of people, and we'll see some of that, a reason for that. There's a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, this beast that rises up out of the sea is not a definitive place. The sea is water. The sea, an image could drop or could rise up out of the sea pretty much anywhere. That's why the second beast that comes on the scene comes off of the land, because we know it comes from Rome. We know it comes from a particular place. So I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these in detail. There are plenty of, I think, items in literature that we have in our United Church of God literature base. There are also quite a number of sermons online concerning each one of these chapters in Revelation. Now, the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, his mouth like the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So here we have putting together Daniel 2, then Daniel 7, 8, and 9. He puts them together in a very succinct place. So the first beast was a leopard, the next beast was a bear, that type of thing. In this case, this beast is a conglomeration of all 4. And it inculcates or puts together aspects of each one of these world-ruling empires. The important thing to understand is the dragon, Satan the devil, gives him his power, his throne, and great authority. I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. Again, could have several applications of that, not just the Roman Empire falling in 476 and then coming back to life when Justinian in 554 announced the left and the right, east and west halves of the Roman Empire having an agreement to come back together with the Roman Catholic Church as a kind of a guiding authority for them. It could also be when the second Babylon comes on the scene, when that cut trunk of the tree comes back to life. It says, all the world marveled and followed the beast. So all the world will marvel at what has happened. When this happens, it's going to be virtually miraculous, and those who are, let's just say, ignorant of God's word, or they have not had their mind open, they don't have the wisdom of God, are going to be following, just like the crowd always follows those type of things. The word sea occurs 24 times in Revelation. Most references are literally the ocean, but some refer to mankind. Here's one, Revelation 17:15 to the bottom. The waters which you saw, or the sea which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So a direct statement that the sea or the waters represent peoples, all the peoples of the earth. Revelation 13:1, I stood on the sand of the sea and saw this beast rising up out of the sea. And so we have this beast that comes up out of the sea. He doesn't come from a place on the land where we know exactly where he's coming from. The beast comes in a miraculous way. So this New World leader, now back when I was in Ambassador College, we used to play these Who is the Beast games. And we had all these names that we put on. We had Franz Joseph Strauss, and we would sort of get together, just sort of in casual talk. The problem is everybody we came up with died. And so it's really hard to have them be the beast power when one after the other they started dying. I remember this fellow that had been the Otto von Habsburg's like second to third grandnephew, twice removed, but his name was Habsburg. And we were really sure that was going to be the guy, but it wasn't. So that was back when we thought none of us would ever be old enough to have kids. But now that I have 9 grandchildren, I can tell you that we had time. We were a little bit ahead of our time, so to speak. God does things when he is ready, not when we are ready for it. So Revelation 17 says, this is verse 11, the beast that was not, or was and is not, is himself also the 8th. Now, let me explain this line, because this is important. Because the beast that was is, of course, the Roman Empire. Is not meant that it died, or at least wise went away from the scene. Then he said, is himself also the 8th. It's the only place the word 8th is used in Revelation. So what's the answer to understanding who this is? Well, the answer is, and we'll get to it in a minute, but I wanted to put it in here. He is of the 7 and is going into perdition. So there are 7 resurrections of the Roman Empire. The last is these 10 toes. So 6 are done, and the 7th is coming. So the 7th, though, is ridden. Remember, there's 7 heads that are ridden by the second beast, what basically is the false church. So the false church rides these 7 heads, but at some point, the beast turns on the false church. And that's given to us in Revelation 17. So at some point, the beast and the harlot don't get along. And while the man of sin still is alive, basically the beast says, I don't want your religious influence anymore. And then he goes back to being a Roman Empire without a church hiding it. That's why he's the 8th. So the first 7 are ridden by this church, but the 8th is not, and the 8th is the one that is going to try to stop the returning Jesus Christ. So this one-world government comes on the scene and then is very quickly ridden by the false church, but after a while there is a conflict, and the beast then says, I'll just make this a military, civil thing. I don't want the religious thing anymore, because he sees the returning Jesus Christ, or whatever happens. We don't know exactly the details. But the 8th then is the final form of the Roman Empire, and it is not ridden by the false church. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they received authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. So that may be the summary of the coming one-world government. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings or 10 nations which have received no kingdom as yet, but they have received authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These have one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. So they voluntarily give their power, military power, whatever power they have, financial power, and their authority to the beast. They will make war with the Lamb. So this 8th resurrection, this final Roman Empire without a religious rider, so to speak, is the one that makes war with the Lamb when he returns. And the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. So he does return in the air, and the saints rise to meet him then before that final battle, apparently. Revelation 13, 4-6. Let's continue in Revelation 13. They worship the dragon, so it's about worshiping Satan, who gave authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who was like the beast, who is able to make war with him. So this 10 toes, these 10 nations that come together, people will wonder, saying, wow, that's a huge military power. Who is able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth speaking great things and great blasphemies, which, of course, is a continuation of Daniel chapter 7, the little horn that comes in among the 7 others that begin speaking great blasphemies against the true God and Creator by saying, he is God. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. So when this beast comes on the scene, he is going to be a blasphemous individual, and the nation will be blasphemous. They will blaspheme God. his tabernacle, meaning where God is in heaven, of course, and those who dwell in heaven. They will deny that. That's already going on in our country, where many of the religious symbols are being torn down, and being religious, believing in God, is being almost made illegal. I'm not sure if any schools anymore still have a Pledge of Allegiance and say the Lord's Prayer in the morning. I always did when I was in grade school, but I hear that's pretty much, you can get in trouble for doing that now, or even saying those things, so who knows. So we already have a civil power that is enforcing godlessness. How far that goes when the beast comes on the scene, we'll wait and see. Right now, we are being desensitized to the things the beast is going to do. It's very, very obvious. Look at what's happened with the LGBT bullying that's gone on in our nation in the last 30 years. It's a desensitization process. They just keep throwing it up, throwing it in your ears, talking about it, and eventually you become desensitized to it. It doesn't even cause a reaction anymore when you see those things. Revelation 13:7-9, it was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So this is going to be a time of persecution of God's people, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. So the beast has authority from Satan the devil over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the earth. So just like they worshiped Adolf Hitler, just like people in Iraq used to worship Saddam Hussein. Talked to one of the veterans who went over to Iraq, said that it was a law in Iraq that in every intersection of a street, major streets in Baghdad, that at least 3 large murals of Saddam Hussein had to be visible. So no matter where they went, there were at least 3 pictures of Saddam Hussein looking down on. Now, the way that applies today is this. If you go to downtown Seattle, on virtually every intersection, you'll see at least 3 Starbucks. No, I'm almost not exaggerating, right? Anybody from Seattle? I know there are a number of them I've been to where you can see 3 Starbucks. So Saddam Hussein's been replaced by Starbucks. But at any rate, it's a worship of a person, worship of a man, and there's so much of that going on in so many nations that are controlled by despots. I saw another beast coming out of the earth. Okay, this is the second beast that comes out of the earth. We know exactly where this comes from. This is a place on the earth where this beast comes out of. The first beast comes out of almost nowhere, just out of humanity. That's why he came out of the sea. He had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. So we know who this is very plainly. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell on it to worship the first beast. So it's a worshiping of the first beast because this religious power comes on the scene. They worship the civil beast and also, of course, the religious leader that rides it, whose deadly wound was healed. So the wound is healed now. Resurrection Babylon is on the scene. The Roman Empire, resurrected, is on the scene. He performs great signs. This is the man of sin that performs signs and miracles, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven. He imitates Elijah. And the earth in the sight of men. He deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast. So God allows Satan to give this person power to do powerful miracles or signs in the presence of the beast. So the 2 work together, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. So it's religious power that makes an image to the beast, and they use that, of course, to be enforcing all over the earth, because it says it was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So it is a religion set up along the same lines as the civil government. He causes all, both great, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So it is essentially a counterfeit kingdom of God with a false, these 2 false witnesses instead of the true witnesses of God. And you have a false Messiah and a false religious leader who says he is the place of God. But they then begin enforcing their religion on all the earth, and people have to have a mark of the beast, which of course has been talked about many, many times. There were many electronic versions. I think the best understanding, of course, is that God's Sabbath, the mark of the sign of God in Numbers and Exodus, is the Sabbath. This is my sign which you shall keep, Exodus 32. So the sign of Satan or the sign of the beast is simply a different day of the week. Let's go back to Daniel chapter 7. As we said, Daniel 2 is the foundational chapter. Daniel 7 adds additional information as it does 8, and then later, of course, 9 through 11. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. And of course, this happened all during, from about 150 BC until about the year 300 BC, where the Roman Empire was virtually unstoppable and destroyed many, many people in its wake. Julius Caesar was proud that he had murdered over 1 million people in conquering Gaul in the 50s BC. So that was certainly a devouring, trampling, and destructive empire. It had its good points too, as far as literature and Latin and all the various things and building, but it was not one that had concern for human suffering or people or blood. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. The first 3 of the horns, of course, were not ridden by the church, but the last 7 were to be. I was considering the horns. There was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by its roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So this other horn that came up during the time of the first 3 became, of course, what we know as the Church of Europe or the Church of Rome. Continuing, Daniel chapter 7, I watched till thrones were put in place until the Ancient of Days was seated. So it's obviously a time of judgment. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool, and his throne was like fiery flame, and its wheels a burning fire, and a fiery issue came out forth from before him. So the wheels are probably the same ones mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 1 and chapter 10 that God showed Ezekiel in vision. So 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, and the court was seated, and the books were open. And I watched them because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. So this occurs, God begins to judge here, while this pompous system, this beast, this world-ruling government of these 10 nations and this church that rides it, all this pompous blasphemy is going on. And of course, this is apparently right before the time of the final plagues. I watched till the beast was slain. That may be Revelation 8, 9, 11, and probably all the way through chapter 17 and 18 when Christ returns in chapter 19 and the beast and false prophet are finally put away in chapter 20, the first couple verses. So when he says, I watched till the beast was slain, takes up a time period of maybe 6 to 8 chapters in Revelation. Its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. So Jesus Christ will return as a flame of fire and devour this beast that tries to stop him when he comes. 2 Thessalonians 2 says, let no one deceive you by any means. He was concerned that Christ was coming soon for them, and they would be deceived by that false prophet who does these miracles. He was also concerned that people had said Christ had already returned. He says that day will not come until the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed. So the man of sin is the second beast, one that comes out of the earth and rides the first beast. The son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God. So these words of blasphemy, very clearly given here by the Apostle Paul, as words that the man is exalting himself above God. He sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So the interpretation of what Paul meant here, sitting in the temple of God, probably the temple in Jerusalem was still there, but I'm not sure that's what he meant. Maybe he meant something to do with the church. Who knows what he means? Maybe he'll build another one. So we'll kind of wait and see. This is one of those verses that we have to keep well in mind so that when it does occur, we'll say, aha, that's it. We recognize it. Okay, the counterfeit kingdom established, the man of sin, the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. That's obviously the man of sin, or like the beast man also, both of them, but certainly in this case he's probably talking about the false religious leader. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan with power, signs, and lying wonders. So he's the one that deceives the whole earth with his miracles and signs and wonders, calls fire down from heaven. mentioned this is the last. All these verses simply add more understanding to the last half of Revelation 13. Then, continuing, the counterfeit kingdom is established. Revelation 17, 1-3. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying, these were the bowls, by the way, that pour out the plagues. Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. So this great harlot, this false religious system who sits on the waters of the earth, meaning the beast power who controls all these waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, false worship, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk by the wine of her fornication. They were made drunk, they were made giddy happy and sort of in a stupor because of this very short-lived economic peace or world paradise, so to speak, that they created for a very short time. This world socialism, this has all of these various equality aspects, perhaps of the manifesto of the United Nations worked into it. So he carried me away into the spirit, into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So very plain who this is, the 7 heads and 10 horns. The 7 heads were the ones that were ruled by the beast power over these 7 heads of the beast. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, so that means royalty. She was dressed up in royal apparel, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and of the filthiness of her fornication. So she was continually drinking and celebrating her abominations and her filthiness. And of course, we see that type of behavior not only exalted today, but paraded around town and promoted by politicians. On her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So she is the mother of much false religion and of abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. So this woman had caused the civil government to kill many people, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and those who follow Jesus Christ, of course, who were then either tortured or forced to give up their lives. The angel said to me, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her. So the woman sits on top of the beast carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. So the 7 heads were the 7 resurrections of the beast that were ridden by this false church. The beast that you saw was and is not. So when this book is to be revealed, the Roman Empire would not have a resurrection, not have a time of government in place. It says, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit. In other words, will come out of almost nowhere. This stump will come back to life. These 10 toes will regroup and form the final resurrection of this empire, of this system. And then they will go into perdition. It won't last long. The 3.5 years or 72 months is the best indication that we have, and that's as long as it will be in existence. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel. Again, when they see this happening, second time in the book of Revelation, we are told all the world will wonder after the beast. In this case, all the world will marvel if their names are not written in the book of life. Daniel said in Daniel 12 that the wise will understand, but those who are not wise will not understand. The wise will also shine like the stars in the night. But very important that we make sure our names are written in the book of life and we have God's understanding, because once this comes to pass, it will happen so quickly that it will be too late to go back and do a deathbed repentance. When they see the beast that was and is not and yet is, so all the world wonders when this beast comes back to life. Here is the mind that has wisdom. 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And that's not too hard to figure out, because in history there have been 6 so far resurrections of the Roman Empire on which the false church, the harlot, sat or ruled. And there are 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. So 5 have fallen, 1 is, although obviously by the time we live in 2019, that pretty much is a thing of the past, but we're waiting for the one that has not yet come. And when he does come, he must continue a short time. So for a short time, this 10-toed one-world government beast will be in existence. The beast that was, that is not, even he is the eighth. So the one that is left after the church and the state have this very big disagreement, and the state says, the beast says, we are going to stop this returning Christ, and we don't need you anymore. So he jettisons the harlot, turns on her, and of course, Revelation talks about the wailing and the lamenting that's going on. So he's of the seven, but he's then going to go into perdition. He's of the seven, he comes out of the seven, he still is the seventh head, but he really is the eighth because he throws off the rule of this false church. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom yet, but will receive authority as kings 1 hour with the beast. And so we're waiting for that time to happen. Revelation 17:13, these have one mind. They give their power and authority to the beast, probably voluntarily, but certainly a short time. They will make war with the Lamb. This is obviously the construction of the eighth, the one that will confront the returning Jesus Christ and be defeated very quickly. They'll make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those with him are called and elect and faithful ones. Let's go on down to the next one just for sake of time here. Okay, the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these hate the harlot. This is where the seventh head, ridden by the beast, by the church, they have this disagreement. These will hate the beast, these 10 horns, these 10 toes that form this new final resurrection. They will hate the harlot for some reason. Doesn't say why. My guess is somebody will overstep their authority and there'll be kind of a disagreement about who's in charge. And make her desolate and naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. So the civil government has far more military power, far more policemen, far more tanks, whatever it would take, and they can very quickly do away with the influence of this false church. So they will make her desolate and naked, and they will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. So they take a lot of the gold, a lot of the all the wealth of the Roman church, which of course is in the many, many, many billions of dollars. For God gave into their hearts to do his mind and to act with one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. So these all happen because God's plan is coming together. The woman whom you saw is the great city, which has a kingdom over the kings of the earth. So here's this city. We all understand which city that is, which has a kingdom over the kings of the earth. And historically speaking, pretty much the only city who has fulfilled that role, of course, would be Rome. The punishment of second Babylon then will continue. After these things, I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was lighted up from his glory, and he cried mightily. So we have another angel, another one of these unnamed angels coming down with a big announcement in the book of Revelation. He cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great has fallen, and has become this dwelling place of demons. So for the second time, the Babylonish system of Babylon is announced as being fallen. Because it mentions here that it's become the prison of every unclean spirit and the cage of every unclean bird, which has been hated, because of the wine of the anger of her fornication, which all nations have drunk. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth became rich from the power of her luxury. Now, the rest of chapter 18, which we don't have time to read, the next 5 or 6 verses, list 18 different items that were bought and sold and traded around the world. It's interesting, one of them is slaves. So it may be some sort of interesting fulfillment to that we'll be able to see. But certainly it's a very short-lived, economically prosperous kingdom, this beast power that will come on the scene. Revelation 18, verse 6, reward her as she has rewarded you, and double to her, double according to her works. In other words, the blood she has spilled of God's people over time, she's to be requited. In the cup which she mixed double to her. As much as she has glorified herself and has lived in luxury, so much torment and sorrow give her, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen and am not a widow, and do not see mourning at all. So God will punish this system of the second Babylon ridden by this false church. Her plagues will come in one day. death and mourning and famine shall be consumed with fire, for the Lord God is God who judges her is strong. I'm sorry, go back to that one. Let me go back to, okay. Okay, the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived in luxury with her will weep for her and will wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. So Jesus Christ is going to destroy second Babylon and this entire system, and some of the kings of the earth are going to really regret that they've lost this short-lived time of pleasure and prosperity that they had. Revelation 18:24, it's important that we kind of go look and see how much, what this means. It says here, in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all those who were slain on the earth, meaning slain for believing in God. This is the history of the persecution of God's followers, proof that God does not forget how much blood is spilled. Remember, he told Cain, who killed Abel, the blood of your brother screams at me from the ground. And certainly there are a number of places that show that God keeps a record of all the blood that is spilled, especially from his followers. So the question is, the blood of the prophets and saints that is now required of the second Babylon, is there a way to calculate it? Luke 11:49-51 says, therefore the wisdom of God also said, I will send them prophets and apostles. This is Jesus Christ's own words. Some of them they shall slay and persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets, which was shed from the foundation of the world, may be required of this generation. So Jesus Christ told the people who lived, the Jews who lived in Palestine in the first century, the blood of all the prophets killed will be required from your generation. You are going to spill the same amount of blood as was spilled by the prophets. Abraham Lincoln understood this because he read the Bible in his second inaugural address. He said God's judgment is true and just if all the blood required from the slaver's whip is now required in the blood of field of battle. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but the same thing. Then he tells us exactly how much. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple. Truly I say to you, it shall be required of this generation. So beginning from the time of Abel until the time of Zechariah, there was a certain amount of blood spilled by persecuting God's people. So the question is, what Zacharias is he referring to? And what was Zacharias' message? Well, the answer is Zacharias lived in about 760 BC. So the time we are starting to calculate quarts of blood begins at the time of Cain killing Abel and ends in about 760 BC. 2 Chronicles 24 tells us about Zacharias. Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, who stood above the temple, and said, this is the message that Zechariah preached that got him killed. Thus says God, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has also forsaken you. Very similar to the message of the two witnesses in Revelation 11. So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. So from the beginning of time until 760 BC, so we can add 1486, and then so maybe around 2,000 or 3,500 years, somewhere around that neighborhood. We have 3,400. We have Josephus recording for us in the Wars of the Jews that 1.1 million inhabitants of Jerusalem were put to death by the Roman general Titus when the city was conquered in 70 AD. So apparently this amount of blood that Jesus Christ said would be required of that generation did take place 40 years later approximately, and the amount was 1.1 million deaths. Now the second half of the story is the blood from 760 BC until now is how much? Because that blood hasn't been required of any generation yet. So if from creation to 760 BC, the total was 1.1 million followers of God killed for their beliefs, what is the number from 760 BC until the return of Jesus Christ, the Messiah? So how many buckets of unrequited blood? Well, we really don't know. A couple indications, though. The angel thrust his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and the blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. So I forget the exact number of miles, but I recall it was 100 and some miles, 6 feet high. So let's just say that this is a whole lot of spilled blood. But then again, a lot of people have been put to death by the false church because they believed in the true God. So the punishment of Second Babylon, Revelation 19:15, now out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations, and he himself will rule with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. So we have the fierceness and the wrath of Almighty God that will then requite the blood of all God's followers who have been martyred since 760 BC until the return of Jesus Christ. So Daniel tells us the purpose of the final persecution of the church, which is yet ahead of us. It says, those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Now, historically speaking, it's the story here of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabean revolt under Judas Maccabee and his brothers, Matthias' sons. And they did great exploits, the first successful guerrilla war in history that we know about. And they were a type of God's people in the end times, some say a type of the Philadelphian era. Those of the people who understand shall instruct many. So those who understand really shall be teaching. They'll warn the world as a witness, Matthew 24:14. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame. Could be a spiritual aspect to this, that many would be spiritually falling, but it doesn't say that, but it certainly could be one understanding. By captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join to them with intrigue. And some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them, and to make them white. Same as Revelation 3, the message to the Laodicean church, that they had to find white linen to purify their garments in the coming fire. To make them white until the time of the end, because it is for the appointed time. So this verse is about the time of the end, and God says it is an appointed time. He knows when it is. We don't know exactly the time or the hour. We're simply watching for the developments to occur. Revelation 18:4-5, I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. Remember back in the verse we just read in Daniel 11, some would not come out. Some would be tricked, some would be lost. So the warning in Revelation 18, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. So the main reason that we study prophecy and try to look at things that are going on in the world to find out, kind of some indications as to what might be happening soon in God's plan, is to make sure that we are coming out of the system and not being a part of it, not sinning as the world sins. 2 Corinthians 6, the Roman Empire that Paul wrote about was certainly immoral, certainly vile in many ways, certainly anti-God, very full of idolatry. The town of Corinth may have been leading the pack in all of those evil ways, as it was a trading town, and it was one of the centers of Greek thought, which means humanistic thinking, threw God out and replace it with the ideas of man. What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So God has promised to live among us, put his spirit in us, and to be our God. We could be his people. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. So that's the main purpose for all that we have studied today and talked about today. We've gone through a lot of information very quickly, but you will see some of these things happening if you live long enough right before your eyes. The important thing is we are determined, ahead of time, to come out from among them and be separate, and don't touch what is unclean, so that we can then be received by God. And so that's the end of the presentation. Thank you all for coming. Hope I haven't asked or caused more questions to pop into your mind than answers. I know we've gone through a lot of prophetic scriptures very quickly. I did do a series on Revelation 21 sermons. So I went through each chapter one at a time about a year ago. They are on the Portland website. And if you'd like to have some more information about some of these chapters, feel free to review those. Anyone with questions, feel free to come up afterwards. But once again, thank you all for coming, and we will see you tomorrow at services.